Well, tonight we have Jessica Murray, astrologer, author, and cultural commentator who's highly regarded for her comprehensive knowledge of astrological symbolism. You can visit her at www.mothersky.com, where you can find the innovative Skywatch service, which tracks the astrological weather. And you can pick up her book, Soul Sick Nation, which we'll be discussing tonight, At the Crossroads, and her anthology called Transpersonal Astrology, which she contributed to. And interestingly enough, she'll also be doing a webinar on these very topics we're discussing tonight on the 11th and 13th and 14th of July in an online astrology webinar. So, with no further ado, I would like to welcome Miss Jessica Murray.
Hello. Is it
Hi,
Stephen?
Hi, yes it is. How are you, Jessica?
I'm very well. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got a lot on our table as we talk about our great nation's birth and its evolution.
Yeah, it's a very special day to be having this talk. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, in your book, Soul Sick Nation, uses a specific birth chart for America. Can you tell us a little bit about that chart, the Sibly chart?
The Sibly chart is this is a hotly contested topic. You know, astrologers always have their own little partisan views on which is the real beginning of this entity we're calling the U.S.A. But there seems to be a consensus that the July 4th, 1776, it's one of the most popular charts for it. And so we pick that time and date in Philadelphia. And there's a whole bunch of controversy, too, about what time that day, you know, where was the moment that marked the first breath, as it were, of this new being. But I use the Sibly chart. It has a Sagittarius rising and so on. I have it in front of me, and I wonder if most of your viewers will probably be familiar with it.
Well, I would hope so. We announced that we'd be using the Sibly chart, and it's definitely a good idea to be looking along with it as we talk. It's really easy to download. You can Google Sibly chart and pick it up for free in a matter of seconds, and it'll definitely help put this conversation into context. So, if America is an entity, looking at the Sibly chart, looking at its rising sign, its moon, its sun, what sort of personality are we dealing with here?
Well, you know, we often use the concept of a personality as being symbolized by the ascendant. And so we have Sagittarius rising, and this is the cowboy, you know. I think its modern incarnation would probably be the NASCAR driver. So there's this, you know, we love this, and people all over the world have been in love with this personality, this cowboy-like personality. You have the 49ers, who struck it out west for San Francisco, is one incarnation of it. And then, you know, there's Marlon Brando on his motorcycle, kind of the reckless and fast-living and independent, and there's John Wayne. And this is a hugely attractive symbol. I think that people all over the world know this as a Sagittarian country. You know, it's one of the reasons I believe in the Sibly chart. And then there's the Aquarius moon, which is in the third house in the chart I use. And it's also trine Gemini Mars. I don't know if this is getting too technical, but it puts together the third house, which is a house of the zodiac that is associated with thinking. And, you know, Aquarius is associated with technology.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the trine aspect?
Say it again.
Could you tell us, explain a little bit what a trine aspect is?
Well, it's a smooth aspect. It actually means 120 degrees of geometrical arc between the planets. So you get this idea that it's relatively easy for this entity to have the kind of thinking that is active, that's Mars, in communications and passing information around. So really, it's a shoo-in for the U.S.A. to manifest something like Silicon Valley.
Sure. Sure. When I see that Sagittarius rising, I think of the foreignness of Sagittarius, the exoticness, and I wonder if that could not be sort of the public face of America, sort of an astrological way of saying you're going to be a nation of immigrants.
That's a good point. I think that the aspect of the seventh house, which is where we have three planets, echoes that. The seventh house is also the house of foreignness. And there's
Right.
really a threefold emphasis on Sagittarius here. If you think about the fact that Sagittarius' ruling planet, which is Jupiter, is right next to the sun in this chart, make it very strong. And then the fact that there's this whole party of planets in the seventh house, which is the house having to do with the foreign policy in a mundane chart. So, yeah, the seventh and eighth are both houses of relationship. And when you look at a country's chart, you see these planets in the seventh, you realize that foreign policy and the way we show up vis-a-vis others are very much a part of our karma.
Well, since Sagittarius is so heavily emphasized in the Sibly chart, we might want to look towards Jupiter to get more information about how this could possibly show up in our everyday reality as a nation. What's the Jupiter energy in America's chart like? Is it in good shape, healthy, unhealthy?
Yeah. The ascendant per se is the view of the self. So in the country's chart, it's our national self-image. And this business of Jupiter, it kind of accentuates everything, making it bigger, so that Jupiter does govern size and increase and growth. And I think it's significant because this is a big, big country with big plans and big fantasies and big ambitions. And everybody wants to come here, as you say, from the rest of the world.
And America has some big people in it as well. Every time you turn around, you read a doctor's report, all the doctors lamenting about how obesity is an
People are
epidemic.
tall here. They really are, and they're too big and they're too obese. So when we look at the higher potential of this archetype, the Jupiter archetype, you can think that, and the Sagittarius rising, at best are moral symbols and ethically driven. And there's an openness and a tolerance to that archetype too. But, the trouble with ethical emphasis is that when it's wielded in an immature way, then we think we're always right.
Ha, sure.
And we don't base our approach on facts, which by contrast Gemini does. Gemini is about facts and statistics. But Sagittarius is about belief. And so what I think is happening with this chart is that you get Cancerian patriotism, which is a very emotional construct, really, and you filter it through the Sagittarius rising, and then it becomes kind of a my country right or wrong kind of thing.
Could this be what's responsible for America's impulses toward war? Would you say America is warlike?
Yeah, I think that we have the Mars in Cancer in the house, and so there is this idea that it's driven by righteousness, and it has this impulse to fight when there's an issue with somebody else, coming together with somebody else. And the other part of it is that it's dualistic. So and I'm thinking of the Mars in Gemini in the seventh house. And I'm thinking of the bellicosity, as you say, and the dualism of thinking that it's either me or you.
Right.
It's a zero-sum game. This is at its most crude. This is not how I think that these things could be expressed, ideally. But it is how we can see they are being expressed.
Well, our Saturn in the 10th house and exalted in Libra, it should give us a better moral leg to stand on, but it doesn't, does it?
Well, I mean, it is, as you say, it's the crowning planet of the chart, and it's in a beautiful placement as it is. it is our sense, for better or worse, of being the dad of the world. And I think that the fact that we refer to our first politicians as fathers, the founding fathers, is really kind of hilarious. We even capitalize the phrase in our textbooks, founding fathers. They're really more like father gods.
Yeah.
And we carved them in stone on Mount Rushmore. And so this idea of being larger than life, like we made them into literally monuments on a mountain. And we do that figuratively. So that's a lot to live up to. And the fact that it's so visible, the literal symbol of those founding fathers being seen for miles around, and then presenting it to the rest of the world from our 10th house. But the problem is, it's so ambivalent. This good dad archetype is very ambivalently held. And we see that astrologically as the square, the 90-degree angle between that Saturn in the Sibly chart and the Sun. That means that those two planets are a quarter of a circle away from each other.
They're making a right angle toward
we
each
would
other.
call that psychologically a father complex. Go ahead.
I see. And for sure, the whole concept of paternity has undergone, call it what you want, a challenge, transformation, but the notion of fatherhood in America is under siege.
That's right. That's true. The Saturn-Sun square always means some kind of conflict. But what I think you're talking about is that there's this discrepancy between the actual state of fathering in this country and this mythology around it. And the statistical reality, this may be what you mean, of the American family is that mothers now keep finances afloat in 40% of the households with children. But we hear about, cultural conservatives seem to think that's weird or aberrant. Not a real family.
Right. It offends their idea of that exalted Saturn.
It's a beautifully exalted Saturn. And they're on to something. The ideal state of the family in terms of archetypes, with a father that leads, and Libra is very beautifully a leadership sign. But what I think is the sickness that not just the U.S.A. has, but that any entity has just as individuals can have, comes from what I'm going to call a cognitive dissonance. I talk about this in more detail in the webinar we're doing next week, but the We the People conference. But where there's a disconnect between the country's official narrative and ordinary people's reality, it creates this malaise in the populace. I don't see the U.S.A. as being fatally flawed. Like you say, that Saturn in the 10th is a beautiful potential, but we're a little bit ill here, and we need healing. And I think that to heal, you have to diagnose. You can't heal without first identifying what's wrong with the patient. So we have, in this instance, a country whose national myth is that families consist of a father, mother, and children, and that the father supports the family physically and is the active force in the outer world. And then the mother supposedly supports them emotionally and keeps the home fires burning. I think that's what the conservative Christians mean when they say traditional, although it's only been traditional since the Cold War years. But now it's totally outmoded. Read that only 12% of American families adhere to that model.
Yes, the America certainly. When I see that Saturn perched at the top of the chart, and I think the 10th house is it represents our reputation, and I immediately think of the criticism given by the isolationists who believe that we should mind our own business, as it were. They always say that we can't be the police force of the world, And is that the sort of astrological signature that would
yes,
cause
but it's ambivalent because, in fact, we are the police force of the world, and the Saturn in Libra imagines itself to be the benevolent father, the pater familias of the whole world. And because this is a deeply unconscious collective value, of course, we think that we're right from the Sag, And this idea of Libra, which is the great Solomonic judge, but it's terribly ambivalent. That's the trouble, is that one part of the chart can feel like it's undermining the other part. And the reality, like since the recession hit, which is still going on, of course, despite the fact that Wall Street is doing better than ever, that just went to undermine the father as breadwinner ideal even more.
It's very interesting that you should bring up Wall Street, because in your book Soul Sick Nation, you talk a little bit about the interaction between Jupiter and Saturn, in the sense that America's Jupiter doesn't know when to stop. It has this ridiculous sense of entitlement, it seems like, where we seem to think anything ought to just have an unlimited growth potential, that the law of diminished returns don't apply to us.
It's really a trip. I mean, there are archetypes in astrology which associate with those very concepts. For example, Jupiter governs expansion, and Saturn governs contraction. And these two planets are square each other in the U.S. chart. They're in conflict. And it's Jupiter, of the two, it's Jupiter that's in the catbird seat, because it's conjunct the Sun. So that's the one that we identify with. You know, we're heavily weighted towards what Jupiter's all about, which is growth. But it's always joined at the hip by decrease or receding, including economic recession.
Looking at this configuration of the sky, I'm thinking, wow, this is a classic picture of someone or something that's in love with bubble economics.
Yeah, it reminds us of that. And I was talking about these things before the great, I mean, we were looking at this astrologically in the chart even before the 2008 recession started getting going, because it's deeply embedded in the psyche, in the group psyche of the country, that you have this knee-jerk reaction by business interests against anything that could be vaguely construed to be a limitation to growth. This is, you know, this terrible suspicion of taxing corporations and of penalizing companies that pollute, or putting rules and regulations of any kind on Wall Street to keep them within the bounds of reality. It's a big blind spot, and it comes down to not understanding how expansion and contraction work together. Because as you say, it only makes sense that inflation and deflation are two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely.
But it's not computing in the deep psyche of the U.S.A. And in my city where I live, you know, in San Francisco, it's just a joke. The housing market, for example, is imagined to have no ceiling at all. Life is just one big dot-com boom that never has to go bust. So we're setting ourselves up for a fall here, that's for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Soul Sick Nation certainly sounded the drum for reform, and we'll talk about that later towards the end of the show, what the common person can do to be a better citizen and to help America be the best it can be. All of this stuff reminds me of the Andy Griffith Show, because it's such a perfect snapshot of all of these archetypes we're talking about. Andy is the benevolent Saturn father. Aunt B is a female Jupiter. And the drunk Otis is an example of what will happen when Jupiter gets out of control. He's big. He's drunk.
That's right.
So that show is amazing how it provides a snapshot for America where it is right now. The only thing missing from that show, however, is the dark god, Pluto, the energy that you'll be discussing in your webinar, and also probably one of the most important astrological factors in the American Sibly chart, a source of a lot of what is negative and what's wrong with America. Can you tell us a little bit about Pluto?
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about Pluto is that it's hidden in plain sight. It's the part of the psyche or the part of an individual. You know, our listeners can look at their own chart and think about where Pluto is that we don't want to admit to. And you know how in mythology Pluto was the god of secrets, and he was the only one with a helmet of invisibility. So we're talking about a kind of power that doesn't show itself. But it
Right.
looms in the background, and everybody acts as if it's not there, but it permeates everything going on. And in the U.S. chart, it's in the house of money.
Ah.
So we've got the most powerful element in the chart, and by the extension in the world, which is the 1%, or the Occupy movement gave it a name, or a number, actually, of the 1%. But it's invisible, this little tiny elite, because it's invisible in the sense that we never see these people's names in the headlines. We don't see the CEO of Chevron on TV. We see celebrities, right? The bankers aren't who are on
Right.
the cover of People magazine.
Right. The
But this is
Bernanke's.
Pluto. This is who's really pulling the strings.
Now, could
And I
that
think
could
it's
that
interesting that Pluto, I mean, obviously, isn't it obvious? It governs plutocracy, and it's in the house of money in the U.S.A. chart. I mean, I always found it so obvious, I just couldn't, I couldn't make sense of why no one used that word,
yeah.
plutocracy, until
Yeah,
now. Now they're using it.
it's amazing
Be-
because
hmm
that Pluto, I think, is a responsible. It foments a lot of rebellion and sort of a subtle existential type of angst. And you've
Yeah,
actually presaged
right.
and talked about various type of insurrections before they have happened. And could some of this be have been encoded or hinted at by Pluto's placement in the American chart?
I just don't see how any astrologer would have been able to look at that Pluto in the second house of money and banks and not have the word plutocracy come on in their mind and start blinking red lights.
Yeah.
But here's what I'm so interested by. I think that the hidden things are much more interesting because they talk about the way our human psyche works and the way it's been with this disconnect between the country's reality and its self-image. If you had called it what it actually is, a plutocracy, it would have been seen as downright traitorous because Pluto governs the concept of taboo.
Right.
But it's really too obvious to ignore now because the economy and the government of the U.S.A. are both arranged to serve the multinationals, which constitute a tinier and tinier slice of the electorate. And the
Sure.
demographics are right there for everybody to see. This is what I mean by hidden in plain sight. But, I think that those financial instruments that got the stockbrokers and by extension all the rest of us in so much trouble when they tanked the world economy, the income swaps and all these really hard to understand esoteric phenomena that they just created, they were Plutonian in the second house symbols too, because they were created with the clear intention of hiding the risk. So the whole catastrophe of 2008 was hidden in plain sight in that way too.
It's amazing.
Am I making sense?
Pluto mythologically is associated with rape and taking by force. He stole Persephone and stole away with her into the underworld. What does Pluto's placement in our chart have to say about criminality in the American economy?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that I might start psychologically by
Okay.
defining those kind of crimes as compulsive. And if we define compulsion as a desire that can't be controlled, a behavior that grows so extreme as to be unhealthy, then I think you can use the word compulsive for the U.S.A.'s relationship to money,
Oh,
and by
yes.
extension, the banking elite's relationship to the social, the goods of the Commonwealth, which is like a rape of the public weal. I don't know if this is too involved, but in Soul Sick Nation, I talk about where this comes from and on an energy level. There's an imbalance between the four elements in this chart. But I think, to be succinct about this, that the idea of a heinous crime comes from Pluto because it pushes everything to extremes. And what's really going on, if you look at it in terms of transformational astrology, is that it backs us up against the wall so that there's nowhere else to go but to transform.
Yes.
That's what happens when the god takes the heroine down into the underworld. That's a symbol for it kills something off in order to force a rebirth. And Pluto did that to Persephone.
One gets the idea that these sneaky and underhanded economic practices or whatever associated with it, that is designed to purge the American economy in the long run, that it's a sicking up, as it were, and hopefully in the long run we'll be stronger because of it. I also can't help but think, because Pluto is also associated with archetypal blackness, and the second house is the house of movable wealth. Do you think that this could also be a signature for slavery, America's ignoble history with enslaving other human beings?
You know, I did make that point in my first book, that I think this whole idea of ownership, actually the ultimate crime in the ownership category, because that's really what the second house is about, is the concept of possession. So the quintessential possession crime is to imagine that we could possess another human being. And I see that as one of the aboriginal crimes of the U.S.A. You might say that, you know, we were born with this sin to wash away, to work off, if you see karma as being something one can burn off. And the second one was the genocide of the indigenous people.
The Indians, sure, because our concept of ownership was wholly at odds with theirs, wasn't it? You talk about that in Soul Sick Nation as well. You know, the Indians, their ideas of ownership were more collective, whereas we need titles and deeds and all of that stuff.
Well, Pluto is about power over. That is, in its crude form, before it's gone into its rebirth phase, if it hasn't opened the door to transformation. This has to be qualified, because this isn't what Pluto has to be. But in its crude form, it's power over style power, not power shared.
Very
it's
interesting.
in the house of territory, so what do we want to do but move in there and overtake Iraq and Iran and anybody else that has gold? The black gold, that is.
So, in this sense, our second house, Pluto, is sort of gets in the way of the nobler aims of our 10th house, Saturn. I believe in Soul Sick Nation, you described it very interestingly, a good cop, bad cop type of face.
That is so true. I think that's exactly true. And, you know, both of those houses, the 8th and the 2nd, where we see Pluto, are involved with businesses and banks. You know, the 8th is more specifically about corporations. And we're so, you know, and the Saturn is sort of ideally the good father who has the good housekeeping seal of approval, like the president. This idea that we need them to be a good man. It's not enough that they be a politician. They have to be a good man. We have to approve of him as a father figure. That comes from the Saturn, and that's the good cop.
Right. There's only been one American president, President Buchanan, in fact, who was a bachelor for the duration of his life.
Is that right?
I was reading that the other night, researching the Civil War. So he was apparently America likes its presidents to be family guys, and not the Seth MacFarlane family guy either.
That's right. They can't be like Berlusconi. They have to be a good, clean father.
Well, I'm also, when I see Pluto in the second house, I can't help but think about more minuscule sources of power, such as the internet, digitized information, banking, for example. You know, that's consisting of just zeros and ones instead of actual gold coin. You know, the sublimization of finances and making it complicated. It's really, really, I think, one of the more powerful planetary energies in the chart.
Oh, yeah, it is to me, too. It's really interesting. But, you know, that digital business is very much the moon in the third house of information. And digitalization is Gemini. Actually, Gemini governs the literal digits. It governs the fingers. And it governs manual activity. But more to the point, the idea of Gemini is binary. So it governs binary code. And that trine you're talking about is, I think, why we have just blossomed with technology and become the world leader.
Absolutely. And seeing that the ruler of Gemini is Mercury. Mercury is involved in a relationship, an angular relationship with Pluto. That's going to bring
Yeah,
up the whole concept of ownership of the airwaves, ownership of the
that's right.
internet, and that's probably
That's
Soul
right. I think
Nation
that's
talks
the
about
next
that.
big fight. I think
Yes,
that's I mean, you can smell the blood already from that battle.
it's
This
going to
idea
be a
of,
big.
go ahead, what were you saying? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I was just going to say it's going to be a big deal because they're locked in an opposition there.
Yeah, that's the only, I mean, that's the only opposition in the chart, and it's the main thing that we need to keep our eye on when we're trying to trace Pluto or the underground power source in this country. And when you think historically, and it wasn't that long ago, when television, in the early days of television, people thought of radio and television as a public service, as an organ of the people. I mean, the
Right.
airwaves were seen as public property. And this you can see also in the moon in the third house. The third is the airwaves. The moon in mundane astrology represents the people. But I
And
mean, to imagine that we thought of the airwaves as to be as free as the air, the actual air that we breathe, that it couldn't be bought and sold. I
right,
think that's
right.
just astounding how far we've gotten from that, you know. It's because of privatization.
Well, Jessica, this is really getting juicy. Before we get too involved in this, I'd like to go ahead and break for a minute. Everybody listening at home, please feel free to visit Jessica at mothersky.com. Check out the Skywatch service. Pick up her book, Soul Sick Nation. It is fascinating. At the Crossroads, also fascinating. And if this topic interests you, you will not want to miss the webinar. And I believe with that, we will take our commercial break here.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Okay, welcome back. Tonight's guest is Jessica Murray, astrologer and cultural commentator. This topic tonight is America's birth chart, and we're very fortunate to have Jessica here, especially in light of all of the current events, the furor, the uproar surrounding Mr. Snowden, and the whole concept of NSA spying and how far America can go to get the information it needs. What are your thoughts about
Mm.
that, Jessica?
Well, I'm very captivated by that, Snowden, and it's just recently that, I mean, relatively late, that astrology got its hands on his birth chart. So there's been a lot of talk about, you know, whether he's for real, actually. His chart is so Neptunian, which is to say that it's an enigma. There's a lot of mystery in it, which suggests that we don't have the full story, and we probably never will. So
Neptune
there's
always
that
also.
part. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say Neptune can also be about illusion and masochism as well, self-martyring
It can
himself.
be about, can be, as you say, actual benefic martyrdom. I mean, the kind of selflessness that you might see in a conscientious objector. And I mean, there is a whole camp who believes that he's doing just what he says he's doing, and that it comes from that kind of altruism. But what it is clearly, even though we don't know for sure, what we do know is that it's born of the Uranus-Pluto square, these transits that are going on in the sky right now. and that it leads back like a bloodhound, sniffing the trail. It leads right back to the aspect in the U.S. chart we were just talking about, because Pluto has to do with privacy. And so we've got the planet of hidden power opposed to Mercury, the planet of communication, in the 8th house, which is associated with spies and corporations. I mean, it's all there. So this is the astrological signature for corporations and governments banding together until they're essentially fused, which is our Pluto and Capricorn in the 2nd house, the plutocratic economy, and opposing the free flow of information. So, we are heading towards our Pluto return as a country. And this is a whole other topic. But suffice it to say that opposition that we've been talking about is sort of being introduced by the Snowden affair. And he's, I consider him an agent of the cardinal cross, the transits that we're going through right now.
He could be he could be a walking version of Mercury himself.
That's right.
An
That's
embodiment,
He's
emblematic
become
of the archetype. Yes.
So you look at his chart, and you're not really seeing the chart of just a person anymore. It's the chart of an archetype. He's become mythic. And for many of us, he's a Promethean figure, which is, the guy who broke ranks from his brothers and sisters in the pantheon of gods and came down and gave advanced technology to humans, which at the time was fire, and was punished for it.
How dare he steal from the gods?
Say it again?
How dare he steal from Mount Olympus?
How dare he steal from the gods, and that he was the maverick who broke rank is so close to the fact of him being a spy who worked in the inner sanctum.
But there's something cunning about Mercury.
To go public. Go ahead.
There's something cunning about Mercury, isn't there? Something impish about him. When you say, because of his youth, and he stole his brother Apollo's sheep or cattle.
Uh-huh. Yeah. That's right.
Mercury in the Hindu religion, I think, corresponds to Lord Krishna, the butter stealer.
Did he steal butter? Oh, that's a good one.
Stole butter. In Christianity, Jesus is associated with the Mercury function, and here we see it as the two thieves who flank him. So this double-bodied, childish mischief is, I think, emblematic of Mr. Snowden.
That's an interesting point, because in astrology, Uranus is the divine trickster. He's not just playing around, but he opens himself up to tremendous privation and punishment by doing this.
We have Uranus opposed to the ascendant in the Sibly chart, don't we?
In the Sibly chart, opposed to the ascendant? No, it's really conjunct the descendant. But yes, that's right. That makes it opposed to the ascendant. Mm-hmm.
So how would that translate into an American reality?
I'm mostly thinking of Uranus in its position currently, which is square to Pluto, which is the NSA revelations that have exposed the control that's being exercised by these agencies. And here's this little trickster, the Uranian Snowden, who comes along. It's very interesting. What's going on is so seismic. I think people's understanding of what the government is, even what a government is as a concept, is in chaos. Because everything about the government, even the spying, has been privatized. We don't even have the good old evil CIA anymore. We've got organizations like Snowden worked for, which are these private corporations. So you can even pay the spies less.
I think America might have to add separation of corporation and state into its arsenal of political innovations. Separation of church and state. They should probably be bedfellows.
Yeah. Right, because they have become fused, like they did with the mercenaries in Iraq. So the government now are contracting out their spying and contracting out their soldiers and joining forces with private companies like Blackwater and like Facebook, whose whole trip is data mining, from the beginning. But most people didn't seem to care about that. I mean, they didn't seem to care when Facebook did what Snowden is saying the NSA did. I think there seemed to be a different quality in people's minds when they find out that their government did this too. But these are all agencies to whom we've ceded our power.
I think maybe going back to the compulsive plutonian spending, where Americans feel they're not really alive unless they're buying something. The idea might be that we don't want to criticize the corporocracy, or what you might want to call it, because then we won't be able to buy our trinkets.
It's really a trip. I think it really is very irrational, the relationship with spending and with debt. Debt this is governed by the 8th house, and it's opposite the 2nd house of spending. And we also have this tremendously ambivalent national issue going on with debt. Because on the one hand, we despise it. There's this Puritan strain, in America's psyche that considers it weak and shameful to be financially dependent. But of course, our whole economic system now is set up to necessitate debt.
Yep.
If the middle class wants to start a business or buy a house, they have to get a loan, so it's become kind of a rite of passage.
The idea of John Wayne getting his house foreclosed on is ludicrous, isn't it?
He can't just build a log cabin anymore. He has to get a debt from a predatory lender.
And yet we have a system where if there is no debt, it collapses, supposedly.
Right.
We have to create debt in order to keep this construct aloft.
And I think that, exactly that, is what the sickness is.
Yes.
Because we're Americans to really digest what you just said. It would be a terribly painful thing to realize, and it would totally upend the American dream, so-called.
Well,
and this being a Cancer nation, that, it's a very emotional sign, and that idea of house buying. Cancer governs real estate. So this American dream is all tied up with, I guess the subtext of it really is, I'm entitled to buy a house. That's what my citizenship entitles me to.
That's a ludicrous notion, but that's what a lot of people think. There's a huge sense of entitlement.
I think that's the subtext, yeah.
You can see it at work in infomercials. You're
saying, this quintessentially American purchase of a house is something that ordinary Americans are less and less able to afford. So the dream becomes just a fantasy. I think that's what's making us so ill.
Well, that brings us to the therapeutic portion of the program. Everything's been sort of warning us. What sort of work can we do as individuals and as a collective? What has to be done? The Pluto work you mentioned and the Saturn work.
I think that's a very good way to put it. And I do say that you have to have a diagnosis before you have healing. So I don't think we can skip this step of, noticing that the populace is very confused and dissatisfied and insecure. And I think that we have to dig underneath the surface to find out why that is. We have to look at the system itself. So we have the fact that, the Pluto stuff, all the cognitive dissonance we're talking about, is the cause of people being very destabilized. And it comes down to the fact that the definition in their heads of living a normal, stable American life has become too estranged from the reality. So first thing we have to do is to ask ourselves, to what extent have we bought into these American dream pictures, which really don't hold water anymore?
Right.
And instead move into a confrontation with the reality, which is that the problem is systemic, that the system is jerry-rigged. It's not just about them personally, This is the trouble, I think, that keeps people from seeing this. It may be that I don't fall into this particular trap, although Goddess knows I have my own, is because I was born without the patriotism gene, and I don't have a whole lot of water. So when I look at water, and the sign Cancer, from the outside, I see it as a very subjective sign. I think it's the most likely of any in the zodiac to take things personally. And so what I'm saying is that I think most Americans still irrationally feel that their lack of solvency is a personal failure. You know, that you know, they're being evicted or that their house is underwater. But as we're saying, the deck is stacked. And I think the first step to heal is realizing that. That, you know, otherwise, what's going to happen? With the financial facts, the only people who can buy real estate are the young tech barons in Silicon Valley, or maybe Arab sheiks and Hong Kong billionaires. But it's not the America that they learned about in their textbooks. And until this, you know, this disconnect is brought to consciousness, we can't heal that. We're not going to get over this.
Yes. With our second house cusp in Capricorn, you know, Capricorn has its moments. You know, it can be kind of ruthless and ambitious. It'll step on people who are weaker than itself to get ahead. You know, that's a very, I think, Capricornian type of situation. And to have Pluto in Capricorn, you know, I think in order to manifest that Pluto energy in a more positive way, I need to look at my own spending compulsions.
Right. That's right. We look at the ways that we are participating in the consumerism that is kind of a national religion at this point. And it takes a boldness to withdraw from something that's so part of the warp and woof of the national psyche. It's everywhere. It's in the ads. It's in the commercials. It's in the billboards when you're driving down the highway. It's in all the popular entertainments. It's in the movies. To buy, like you said, to spend. And if we could dare to do that, and to do that, what would we need to dare like that? We'd need probably the boldest placement that I can think of in astrology is Uranus in Aries, and that's exactly what we've got going on now in the sky. Yes. In other words, we have exactly the right kind of courage-building transits to make us break away, like we're talking about.
Yes, Aries is a cardinal energy. It's like an atomic explosion. It gets things started. It's the ignition.
So the atomic part is Pluto, literally, in the sense that Pluto governs, you know, the atom bomb, Plutonium. And the idea that the only way to change for deep structure change is to take something down to its smallest building blocks, the atoms, in order to purge it and start all over again. And I think that's what's going to have to happen here to our second house. People are going to have to understand what the capitalist economy is about, you know, by daring to look it in the eye.
Well, coming up here in a few years, we're going to have the Pluto return, which is essentially almost an eclipse or conjunction of natal Pluto with the transiting Pluto. It's a big deal. Yeah.
It's a big deal. It only happens once in 2.5 centuries for Pluto to come back to where it started. So we've never had one yet. This is our first one. As a young country, we're not old enough to have already had one. So I look at things like indie capitalism. I don't know much about it, but just the concept of crowdsourcing and Kickstarter, you know. The tech world has come up with some extremely exciting ideas which completely eviscerate old school capitalism. You know, we would expect that when we consider that advanced technology is governed by Uranus. In other words, the whole cyber life, the whole approach of the high-tech world is governed by Uranus, and that it's square to Pluto in the sky right now, which implies that it's going to have the power to break it down. Break down
Uranus is the key. Uranus also has a humanitarian angle to it, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Aquarius can be a very philanthropic.
It's humanitarian. It really is the planet that has the eye out for the human race as a whole, that goes beyond the ego. So I think what you have with Uranus and Pluto together is a concept of how, well, that's what crowdsourcing is, isn't it? Just the phrase of how people individuals all doing their own thing through the age of Aquarius approach to life, can actually take a gradual but radical shift from the top-down way of monetizing everything to a literally democratic way of doing it. I mean, this is very abstract, but it's going to have to be abstract at the beginning because we can't imagine what this would look like.
Well, it looks like there'd be a striving towards materialization of this abstractness because our sixth house of labor is in earthy Taurus, and Uranus is in that house.
That's
so
right. Uranus is right there.
The Uranus work is going to have to be materialized and made concrete in order to. That's going to be the key to this thing. It seems like that's what the chart is saying.
Well, that would be nice. What we now have, actually, in the tech world, as far as money goes, is a teeny tiny little minority. It's a plutocratic minority, in fact, of, where the wealth has gone. Most tech workers in the country, goddess knows in the whole world, don't have that kind of money by any means. So what unfortunately I think might have to happen as we begin this transformative process is that at first the solution to the problem, which is going to have to be technology in part, at first it echoes the old style Capricorn striations, the hierarchy of the old school way, before it can, I think that's what we're seeing now, before it can burst free.
Wow, it reminds me of the ancient Chinese, I hate to call it a curse, but that's what everybody calls it. May you live in interesting times.
Boy, these really are interesting times, aren't they?
They certainly are. I know I'm excited about the pending Pluto return. That's going to be an I'm almost a little frightened, to be honest.
Well, I always go back to the fact that this is a belief, a faith even, that we were all born now for a reason. Then on the soul level, we did make a decision to be born right now and at no other time. So now we're living it out.
Words to live by. Well, Jessica, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I can't thank you enough for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And again, don't walk to mothersky.com, and you'll find a lot there to read, research. Pick up her books if you want to explore this topic. Soul Sick Nation goes into it. At the Crossroads goes into it. And again, in the webinar, July 11th, 13th, and 14th, you'll be able to listen to Jessica discuss this Pluto energy more in depth. So, wow, that was really amazing.
Are you there?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Parsing all of this. I think. 1 second. Well, that was a great interview.
Yes, it was.
I think we do our banter now, right?
Good. It was. Well, you have to say something about things.
Sorry.
Let's say goodbye to Jessica. I know you're in awe as a keen astrologer.
Yes, he's stunned.
Of the
He's
goddess
flabbergasted.
Jessica Murray, but you need to say goodbye to her, Stephen, before you move on.
I'm still here.
You're quite right.
Just trying to figure out what's happening.
Well, I'll say goodnight too. It was great. Thank you.
Are you
Thank
Brenda?
You. It was really
Hi,
awesome.
Brenda.
Thank you,
That
Jessica.
was great.
Amazing.
Thank you. It was a great interviewer.
Blessed be.
Really fun. Thank you. Where are you located?
Oh, I'm in North Carolina,
You're
down
in North
south.
Carolina, Stephen. Okay. And where's
Right.
everybody else?
California. Brett,
Okay.
the girls are in California.
Where are you in California?
I live in Coronado area. San
Okay.
Diego.
I'm
Cool.
in Southern California, near Temecula, Riverside
Oh.
County.
Riverside. That's where my family lived. Yeah.
Yeah, Riverside County.
Uh-huh. Gosh, isn't it amazing? And here we are all on the phone.
Yeah. It's like we should. No mistake there.
It really is a small world. I took a bus to Riverside County once when I was 15. Sort of kind of ran away from home situation. It was fun.
Stephen, how's your mother doing?
Oh, she
She's
is
recovered.
absolutely fine, praise God. She got out of the hospital. She was hospitalized for a heart attack, but she's out now. She sounds just like her usual self, and I'm very
Oh, that's
grateful.
wonderful. That's
Yes,
wonderful. All
yes.
right, everybody. Well, I'm so
Night.
pleased, and I'm so grateful for you to you for having me on again.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on, Jessica. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know our listeners did as well.
Wonderful. I hope they did. Okay, everybody. Good night now.
Good night.
Ciao.
Good night.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.
Everything, making it bigger so that Jupiter does govern size and increase and growth. And I think it's
Ah,
significant because this is a big, big country with big plans and big fantasies and big ambitions. And everybody wants to come here, as you say, from the rest of the world.
and America has some big people in it as well. Every time you turn around, you read a doctor's report, all the doctors lamenting about how obesity is an
People are
epidemic.
tall here. They really are, and they're too big and they're too obese. So when we look at the higher potential of this archetype, the Jupiter archetype, you can think that, and the Sagittarius rising, at best are moral symbols and ethically driven. And there's an openness and a tolerance to that archetype too. But, the trouble with ethical emphasis is that when it's wielded in an immature way, then we think we're always right.
Ha, sure,
And
sure.
we don't base our approach on facts, which by contrast Gemini does. Gemini is about facts and statistics, but Sagittarius is about belief. And so what I think is happening with this chart is that you get Cancerian patriotism, which is a very emotional construct, really, and you filter it through the Sagittarius rising, and then it becomes
Public face of America, sort of an astrological way of saying you're going to be a nation of immigrants.
That's a good point. I think that the aspect of the seventh house, which is where we have 3 planets, echoes that. The seventh house is also the house of foreignness. And there's
Right.
really a threefold emphasis on Sagittarius here. If you think about the fact that Sagittarius' ruling planet, which is Jupiter, is right next to the sun in this chart, make it very strong. And then the fact that there's this whole party of planets in the seventh house, which is the house having to do with the foreign policy in a mundane chart. So, yeah, the seventh and eighth are both houses of relationship. And when you look at a country's chart, you see these planets in the seventh, you realize that foreign policy and the way we show up vis-a-vis others are very much a part of our karma.
Well, since Sagittarius is so heavily emphasized in the Sibly chart, we might want to look towards Jupiter to get more information about how this could possibly show up in our everyday reality as a nation. What's the Jupiter energy in America's chart like? Is it in good shape, healthy, unhealthy?
Yeah. The ascendant per se is the view of the self. So in the country's chart, it's our national self-image. And this business of Jupiter, it kind of accentuates.
Well, tonight we have Jessica Murray, astrologer, author, and cultural commentator who's highly regarded for her comprehensive knowledge of astrological symbolism. You can visit her at www.mothersky.com, where you can find the innovative Skywatch service, which tracks the astrological weather, and you can pick up her book, Soul Sick Nation, which we'll be discussing tonight, At the Crossroads, and her anthology called Transpersonal Astrology, which she contributed to. And interestingly enough, she'll also be doing a webinar on these very topics we're discussing tonight on the 11th and 13th and 14th of July in an online astrology webinar. So, with no further ado, I would like to welcome Miss Jessica Murray.
Hello. Is it
Hi,
Stephen?
Hi, yes it is. How are you, Jessica?
I'm very well. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got a lot on our table as we talk about our great nation's birth and its evolution.
Yeah, it's a very special day to be having this talk. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, in your book, Soul Sick Nation, uses a specific birth chart for America. Can you tell us a little bit about that chart, the Sibly chart?
The Sibly chart this is a hotly contested topic. You know, astrologers always have their own little partisan views on which is the real beginning of this entity we're calling the U.S.A. But there seems to be a consensus that the July 4th, 1776, it's one of the most popular. Marlon Brando on his motorcycle, kind of the reckless and fast living and independent, and there's John Wayne. And this is a hugely attractive symbol. I think that people all over the world know this as a Sagittarian country. You know, it's one of the reasons I believe in the Sibly chart. And then there's the Aquarius moon, which is in the third house in the chart I use. And it's also trine Gemini Mars. I don't know if this is getting too technical, but it puts together the third house, which is a house of the zodiac that is associated with thinking.
Ah, okay.
And, you know, Aquarius is associated with technology.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the trine aspect?
Say it again.
Could you tell us, explain a little bit what a trine aspect
Well,
is?
it's a smooth aspect. It actually means 120 degrees of geometrical arc between the planets. So you get this idea that it's easy relatively easy for this entity to have the kind of thinking that is active, that's Mars, in communications and passing information around. So really, it's a shoo-in for the U.S.A. to manifest something like Silicon Valley.
Sure. When I see that Sagittarius rising, I think of the foreignness of Sagittarius, the exoticness, and I wonder if that could not be sort of the
parts for it. And so we pick that time and date in Philadelphia. And there's a whole bunch of controversy, too, about what time that day, you know, where was the moment that marked the first breath, as it were, of this new being. But I use the Sibly chart. It has a Sagittarius rising, and so on. I have it in front of me, and I wonder if most of your viewers will probably be familiar with it.
Well, I would hope so. We announced that we'd be using the Sibly chart, and it's definitely a good idea to be looking along with it as we talk. It's really easy to download. You can Google Sibly chart and pick it up for free in a matter of seconds, and it'll definitely help put this conversation into context. So, if America is an entity, looking at the Sibly chart, looking at its rising sign, its moon, its sun, what sort of personality are we dealing with here?
Well, you know, we often use the concept of a personality as being symbolized by the ascendant. And so we have Sagittarius rising, and this is the cowboy, you know. I think its modern incarnation would probably be the NASCAR driver. So there's this, you know, we love this, and people all over the world have been in love with this personality, this cowboy-like personality. You have the 49ers, who struck it out west for San Francisco, is one incarnation of it. And then, you know, there's